Nobody could have predicted the path the night took. Instead of Kirk Frost and Lil Scrappy celebrating together, fans saw a heated brawl. Discussion that quickly gained popularity within the love and hip-hop community. It seems that what started out as a pleasant chat turned into something worse when someone said something that hurt more than anyone could have predicted. Witnesses said tensions had been rising for weeks, and it was at this moment that everything finally came to a head. As he questioned dedication and respect, his angry voice reverberated around the room. His excitement was exactly matched by Kirk, who never backs down. Emotions were running high, and locals said the tension in the air was so heavy they could almost feel it crushing on their chests. Okay. Horror engraved itself on the faces of everyone there. But what really shocked viewers was when Momma Dee, who is frequently outspoken and she never hesitated to defend her child. Her reaction added gasoline to the already raging flames. The fight involved more than simply two people criticizing one another. It spoke to something deeper, something raw and incomplete. Now, the entire LHH community is buzzing, wondering what led to the escalation of this argument. The night had been heavy with silence. The murmuring throughout the city would not cease. The same story that had drawn everyone in was circulating through dimly lit living rooms, the sides of streets, and little pub corners. It was more than a rumor now. Now, nobody could understand the fact that Tood had died suddenly. He was more than just a rapper. He stood for pure, undiluted vigor. A guy who, via his music, made his agony visible to everyone. When word first leaked out that he had passed away, many people didn't believe it. Others thought it was just another public relations stunt, a crude joke that the internet frequently plays on its celebrity. But when the hours turned into days, and footage appeared, the voices closest to him began to crack under the weight of grief, and the truth settled in like a heavy storm cloud that would not go. Those acquainted with him were overcome with emotion. One friend said he was the kind of guy who could make a room full of strangers feel like home. Some depicted him as a troubled person battling demons that only grew louder as he rose in prominence. He was fascinating because of the contradictions in his demeanor. But no matter what other people thought of him, the power was indisputable. He carried on stage. He was not polished. He wasn't perfect. But he was sincere. Furthermore, in an industry where authenticity has long been valued, he was a singular voice that always seemed sincere when asked. The circumstances surrounding his death only worsened. The mystery. Reports were mixed. Some said it was an accident, a horrible sequence of circumstances. At the sound of invisible hands pulling strings in the distance, some whispered darker stories that hinted at betrayal. Did the animosity between his followers and the field that had greeted him before grow as the speculation did? What caused the ambiguity in the response? Why did those closest to him still speak in half sentences and carefully selected phrases? It appears like every fresh piece of information released to the public creates something new, one from which there is no way out of the maze of inquiries. The more they tried to understand, the more they felt detached from reality. During this turmoil, his family was crying and in the spotlight, something they had not asked for. Microphones were pressed into their faces, vigilant cameras flashed, and they were questioned when they preferred to remain silent. A distressed mother cried during one meeting, saying that her son shouldn't have departed so soon. The impact of her sorrow was felt even by those who had never known him. There had always been a lot of highs and lows in Thud's connection with his family. But at the moment, every unresolved conflict was relegated to the past. Because the tragedy had left a wound that would not go away, the world was seeing every gesture, every tear, and every comment they made. Stated. But the industry fought its own shame. Producers started announcing in public their confidence in his skills, their conversations with him, and their goals. Many followers, however, saw the dishonesty underlying these comments. Where were these voices when he needed them most? Where were they while he was? Weeping in ways few noticed, begging for help via his songs. Because of the nasty hypocrisy, social media became a blame game. According to some, he was used by the industry until he was exhausted. Others agreed, arguing that personal choices were more significant. Regardless of who was at fault, everyone agreed on one thing, though. There was an unfillable gap left by his demise. As the story progressed, so did the theories. Internet users began assembling fragments of his last days, including films, live broadcasts, and private conversations that suddenly gained new meaning. One of his final pieces had a statement about his followers shivered at the thought of being surrounded by people who didn't actually care. Was that a hint? Was he acknowledging that he was being pressured? Supporters continued their search for explanation as a result of the uncertainty. Forums were full with discussions, threads were endless, and every bit of information was scrutinized. In their suffering, many held on to stories in the hopes that they might bring him back, or at the very least make sensation of the chaos that remained. In the middle of the turmoil, one name kept coming up. A friend turned adversary ended up in a bitter feud with him when they shared stages. Many individuals believed their split had something to do with financial betrayal and loyalty, even if the details were never disclosed to the public. There were rumors that this person knew more than anybody else about the days leading up to his death. Suspicion was only increased by the deafening quiet of that camp and the lack of a statement. The fans wanted answers, the family wanted peace, and the industry wanted control over the narrative. But neither side was ready to give what the other asked for. It was too much hardship. Despite all the speculation, the most unsettling information came from those who were there in his final hours. As though his mind were juggling many realities at once, they described him as anxious, pacing, and speaking in fragmented snatches. He discussed his plans for new songs and his readiness to start again and approach things more seriously in his epiphanies. But then his voice would pause. His hands would tremble and he would go silent. According to one person, he seemed to be a guy carrying a load that no one else could see, a weight too heavy for one person to bear alone. The images of him continued to linger in the minds of those who cared. Rather than a rapper who died too young, it portrays a person who has been suffocated by pressures too big to overcome on their own. The place most impacted by his death was his hometown. Almost instantly, paintings including words like "forever" and "never forgotten" began to appear on walls and bridges, capturing his visage. His music would blare from car windows as he drove through neighborhoods. The streets appeared powerless to stifle his voice. Fans lit candles, sent flowers, and told him how his music had gotten them through their worst hours. To them, he was more than just an artist. He was a companion when one was lonely, a rock when things became tough, and a reminder that hardship might be turned into strength. The group's shared grief evolved into a movement calling for his name to be remembered and not to be written off as another statistic. However, while the tale was in mourning, shadows began to emerge. Those close to him started receiving subliminal indications to keep silent and threats. Journalists who were going too far in exploring the circumstances of his death had their doors suddenly closed. A few interviews were canceled, sources who had previously talked openly withdrew, and the film mysteriously vanished. It appears like someone wants the story to remain incomplete in order to hide the truth under layers of misinterpretation. This silence could not be broken by any answer, raising the possibility that something more serious and dangerous caused the catastrophe. The question about they couldn't be answered, yet everyone's lips were simple. Who really knew what had happened to Toot, and why did they remain silent? In search of an answer that never seemed to materialize, the world waited tensely, torn between anger and despair. To come after. The feeling that something significant was being withheld only grew stronger as the days turned into weeks, entangling everyone further in a never-ending story. The room remained quiet for what felt like hours. The trembling figure in the corner caught everyone's attention after a few moments, even if it was only a small one. someone who was clearly bearing more weight than everyone else knew. There were questions hanging in the air, but no one dared to ask them. But under the surface, emotions were boiling, ready for a single spark to set the whole thing on fire. It concentrated on the cracks that could have been forming for months or even years, going beyond what had already been expressed. It was difficult to ignore the fractures now. When the first words finally come, they were more subdued than expected, and almost drowned out by the thumping of nervous hearts. But no scream could have stung as hard as the reality they delivered. It was an honest, brutal, and uncompromising confession. Each sentence pulls back another layer of the facade, items that everyone had clung to for a long time. The truth was damaging in addition to being unnerving. Relationships might be ruined. Family. Members could turn against one another, and secrets could be revealed that some people would want to keep hidden. The answers came quickly and overlapped in a mad rush of disbelief, anger, and misery. One individual tried to diffuse the tension by slapping their fist on the table and demanding answers, but their voice broke under the pressure of upholding order. The area was no longer cohesive enough to serve as a battlefield of emotions. The worry grew with each second. Voices are swelling, accusations are flying, and every action is becoming more sharp and violent. In their hearts, everyone understood that nothing would ever be the same. Too much had been spoken and too much had been exposed. In the middle of it all, one person stood oddly silent, observing every face in the room. They weren't reacting like the others, at least not in a noticeable way. Instead, there was a cold calculation going on. Their silence, as though they were planning a move in real time, anticipating the perfect moment to employ words that were more potent than a blade. When they eventually spoke, the effect was instantaneous, as though everyone had known instinctively that whatever came next would tip the scales. There was a stunned quiet in the room. The words were deliberate, measured, and full of significance. Something anybody may miss. It was not only self-protection. It was about calling attention to the shortcomings of others. Subtle reminders of past mistakes were dropped precisely to rekindle old scars, much like daggers. It was a cruel, yet effective strategy. One by one, those who had been the most vocal began to falter, their self-esteem deteriorating as the fallout from their past errors finally caught up with them. The erect now found themselves defensive, their voices becoming weaker, their beliefs crumbling. But not everyone was ready to be silenced. A piercing yell ripped through the air like thunder, and all eyes snapped to the source. Their anger was undeniable, but it was accompanied by a weakness that made the explosion a request for help rather than an attack. They were tired of carrying the burden alone, of pretending to be strong while collapsing in quiet. They spoke of unrequited love. That was never fully returned. Betrayal and unrecognized sacrifices. Each line was paired with even the most war-hardened individuals were wounded by such unadulterated honesty. But rather than softening hearts, the sensitivity fueled further division. Some gave sympathetic nods, as though they were now hearing the truth they had been too afraid to speak. Others went on the defensive, unwilling to accept accountability or acknowledge their part in the growing chaos. As the distance grew, what had started out as a heated argument once again turned into chaos. Voices sounded, tears mixed with anger. And in the midst of everything, the threat of complete collapse loomed over them like a dark shadow. Outside the room, there were already rumors going around. What was happening within could not be concealed. Bits and pieces of the truth were being spread by those unable to cope with the shock of what they had just heard. Rumors gained momentum with every recounting and circulated swiftly. By the time the discussion within reached its peak, rumors were already rife in the outside world. Each rumor becomes more exaggerated than the one before it. What started out as a private disagreement would quickly turn into a public controversy that would be difficult to ignore and halt. Once they were inside again, exhaustion set in. The power that had first caused the storm began to lessen as voices broke and the screaming subsided. People sank back in their chairs, their anger replaced by silence. Their eyes did not meet, as though the reality had become too heavy to confront directly. The stillness was not peaceful, yet it was stifling and full of unspoken messages. Awareness that nothing needed to be resolved. It was a far worse position than it had been. There was no trust anymore. Relationships had been damaged, and all attempts to move on appeared futile. Then there came a voice no one had ever heard, slowly but surely, breaking the stillness. It wasn't the authoritative voice or the one who had dominated the discussion before. Instead, it belonged to someone who, until now, had mostly listened, observed, and waited in the background. There was something more than icy tactics or allegations in their remarks, an appeal for honesty, accountability, and the chance to back off before it was too late. There was no request, neither a plea for forgiveness nor loyalty. Without hiding, bending, or running away, it was hard to face truth head-on. The impact was unanticipated. Several individuals listened with tears in their eyes as they recognized the depth of the sadness that had been ignored for too long. Others writhed uncomfortably, unable to fully resist the call for vulnerability but also hesitant to reject it outright. The room was once again on the brink of reconciliation and dissolution, with no clear way ahead. Nobody spoke again, for a long time. But this time the silence seemed different. It wasn't the silence of fear or dread. It was the silence that accompanied acknowledging reality and realizing that a change was necessary, even if nobody knew how. The chamber trembled at the sight of someone who had been nowhere to be seen during the chaos, and the door creaked open beneath the weight of that moment. Their appearance totally altered the atmosphere since they possessed strength, influence, and the ability to alter all that had been spoken. Eyes widened, breathing caught, and hearts thumped. It seemed as though everyone knew deep down that the story was far from finished, and that the real effects were only beginning to manifest. As the word spread like wildfire, the terror it provoked only became worse every hour. People were guessing, and arguing on the internet. Those concerned with the issue were behind the scenes, scuttling in silence. It was more than just a controversy now. It was turning into a severe circumstance that would harm reputations and relationships for all time. As stories spread about who knew what and when, trust became even more elusive. All of a sudden, every glance, every pause, every stillness seemed suspicious. Those who had formerly stood firmly together were now doubting each other's loyalty. The room was filled with accusations, and behind closed doors tempers flared. Simply said, there was such a strong sense of betrayal that anyone who dared to speak would be strangled. Neither understanding nor peace prevailed. People who were once allied or now seemed to be enemies forced to live together. Words that should have been measured came out rough, and secrets that should have been preserved were disclosed in bursts of rage. No one wanted to take responsibility, but everyone wanted to place the blame. Beyond the circle, the media produced their own picture. In order to create tales that made their headlines, they combined unrelated bits of information, become fully developed after that. Stories and rumors were misrepresented as fact. What was real was irrelevant now. What mattered was what might pique the most curiosity. Fans helped fuel the mania by consuming everything. Those in its core, however, lacked control over their own story, and the stress became unbearable as fresh stories emerged daily. An extra degree of uncertainty. Relationships began to break down due to doubt. Conversations turned into disagreements, and disputes turned into silence. A never-ending cycle of questioning others and justifying themselves ensnared the players. What had formerly been times of amusement and confidence were now accompanied by suspicion and distance. It seemed as though the foundation that held them together was eroding, and no one knew how to keep it from completely collapsing. Then came the unexpected meeting that nobody had expected. Since emotions were so sensitive, even the smallest spark may cause an outburst. They spoke things that should never have been said, and that went deeper than